I'm Jason Riley, and my first guest today is Nicole Gelinas of the Manhattan Institute to talk about New York's decision this week to extend its rent control laws for another 3 years, I believe, right? Okay, so first, for people who may not be familiar with how these laws work, how do they work, Nicole?
Well, you've got federal, state, and local governments all involved in this. What happened, the short story is, after World War I, a lot of veterans coming home to the city during the war, there wasn't very much construction, and so rental prices skyrocketed. In response to that, the mayor of the city and the governor declared a housing emergency. There was a little break in the emergency between World War I and World War II, but after World War II, same thing happened. Governor put in place the housing emergency again, saying, in essence, we don't have enough rental housing, rental prices are too high, let's put strict government caps on how much landlords can charge to rent these apartments. And that's exactly how it's been, with some minor changes for the past half century and more, where you've got the federal government that does a census determining there's a housing emergency. You've got state laws that govern what happens when that emergency kicks in, and you've got the mayor of the city that certifies this every 3 years, and who puts in place the board that decides how much rent can go up every year, 3%, 5%.
Okay. Now, proponents of these laws say that they're necessary because there isn't enough affordable housing in some of these cities, which are famously expensive to live in. What's your response to that?
Well, the rent regulation itself creates the shortage, because what happens is landlords know they're not going to get a good return for massively investing and upgrading their housing. So a lot of the existing housing deteriorates.
Right.
Landlords can build luxury housing that's priced too high to be in the cap, but of course it's luxury housing, so you have to be wealthier to live in that housing. And because people in apartments for a long time, they are paying much, much lower rental prices than someone moving to the city looking to get an apartment, they have an incentive to stay in their apartments for years and years, even if they don't need such a big apartment anymore and might like to move from a 2-bedroom to a studio. So the whole system just stays kind of frozen in place.
Yeah. So Donald Trump has no incentive to build housing for moderate and low-income people because the government's going to tell him how much he can charge rent. It's going to affect whether, if ever, he'll get a return on that investment. So his incentive is only to build luxury apartments, because then he can charge whatever he wants for them.
Right, and it also contributes to the quality of housing, because say you live out in Brooklyn or Queens, you know, not in a trendy neighborhood, but good 45 minutes, an hour away from Midtown Manhattan, you may live in a nice middle-class building and pay $900, $1,000, but it may be $100 or $200 less money than the landlord needs to keep the building in good conditions. So he's losing a little money every year. You think you're getting a good deal, but instead you don't get your dishwasher fixed, your windows aren't cleaned. Everyone is a little bit more miserable than they need to be.
Another one of the sort of bizarre products of these rent control laws is how wealthy individuals can benefit at the expense of ordinary people. Famous stories about celebrities, Cyndi Lauper, or Mia Farrow. Governor David Paterson, the former governor of New York, maintained a rent-controlled apartment while he was governor. Mayor Ed Koch, a former mayor of New York, for 12 years, simultaneously maintained a rent-controlled apartment. So all these perverse incentives, it encourages more people to live alone because it's artificially depressing the price of housing and encouraging more people to think, well, I can afford to live alone, which of course creates a shortage of units.
Exactly. There's no rhyme or reason to it, because it's the government deciding, not the marketplace. So if you're an immigrant family, you need a 3-bedroom apartment, but you can only afford a 1-bedroom apartment, but yet you may have an elderly widow living in the 3-bedroom apartment. She should really be living in the 1-bedroom, but they can't rearrange themselves because there's no free market. And you talk about wealthy people. If it's a housing emergency, you would think that would mean you don't want someone having 2 houses, but you've got a lot of people, and I think that will help get you to your next topic as well. We can talk about that, but you've got people living in these rent-regulated apartments, but they've got second homes out in the suburbs, out in the Hamptons, and so if there's an emergency, they should give up their apartment and go live in their other house. So,
what I wanted to ask you about is there's a case in New York that may reach the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is soon going to decide whether to hear the case. Why don't you tell us about that? It involves rent control.
Sure. We have a landlord in the city on the Upper West Side, Jim Harmon. He and his wife own a brownstone, and they have had 3 sets of tenants in place in the upper floors of these brownstone. They live on one floor. These tenants have been in place in a couple of cases for several decades. One of the women has another home out in the Hamptons. Mr. Harmon and his wife would like to take over at least one of these apartments so that they could use it for their own family, their grandchildren. But what happens is the law doesn't allow them to say to the tenant, okay, your 1-year lease is up or your 2-year lease is up. We're sorry, but we'd like this apartment back for our own use. Instead, it's compulsory that the landlord has to sign a new lease with the existing tenant. And so what brings you to the Supreme Court cases is very similar to the case over the Obama healthcare law, where does the government have a right to make a person sign a private contract? Because you've got a lease that's a private contract, and the state government is telling Mr. Harmon, you have to sign this lease. You have no choice. You can't kick your tenant out once the lease is expired. And is that something that's constitutional?
Okay. And I guess there's also a Fifth Amendment issue here with a property without due process.
Yes, that's true as well, because you're using the property for a government decreed social purpose that the government has said the social goal here is lower priced housing. But they're using Mr. Harmon's property to achieve that goal without paying him any money.
Well, it sounds like if the Supreme Court wants to strike a blow for affordable housing and ordinary Americans, they should take this case.
Yeah, and they'll decide whether to take it or not probably in the next month or so. So another exciting case, at least here in New York.
Yes. Thank you very much for
Thank you,
joining us,
Jason.
Nicole. Appreciate it.